Welcome to Anther Dish, the show about food, culture, and identity. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Dugnan. Defining the foodways of a nation is tricky business, and doubly so when it factors in ideas of what quote-unquote authentic or traditional foods can and should look like. So what happens when these understandings of national foods are also rooted in government policies to maintain affordable eating? What impact does this have for those working in food and hospitality? My guest today, T.W. Lim, is here to explore how this has played out in Singapore through the hawker centers the country is known for. T.W. writes on the relationships between politics, history, and culture and how they have shaped eating habits in Singapore. By day, he writes about technology, but he also writes about food and value, or the regard that something is held to deserve, the importance, worth, or usefulness of something. While known to many other countries as a food paradise over the last 50 years, TW unpacks how Singaporean food worth and value is decided upon in a country where food is identity. In his new book, Little Perfections, Eating in Singapore, he looks at the development of hawker centers, home kitchens, and restaurants of Singapore in a way that really gets at the culture and business components of food in Singapore. In today's conversation, we look at the early government policy of Singapore and its lasting impact on the development and maintenance of hawker centers, grappling with notions of authenticity as economic and cultural values around food and eating shift through time, labor and wages for multi-generational hawker workers, and how Singapore as a food paradise holds up a mirror to the food habits of the USA and Asia. Here's my conversation with TW. Welcome to the show, TW. How are you doing today?
I am grand. Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much for joining me. Do you mind giving people a snapshot about who you are, where you're coming in from today, and the type of work that you do?
Sure thing. So I am here because I recently launched a book called Little Perfections, Eating in Singapore. It's a collection of essays about food culture, and cooking in Singapore. And I think the best way to give you a bit of background about who I am is actually to read the opening of the book.
Yes, please. I'd love it.
So the book starts, I'm a somewhat unusual cook. My main qualification for the profession is that I was born and raised in Singapore, where food is both secular obsession and national religion. I didn't learn to cook at my mother's side or my grandmother's. And though my grandfather had been a cook for some years, we didn't speak of it in the family. In Singapore, good sons do not learn to cook. They study hard and go to uni and get jobs in nice, clean places with climate control. I was a merely indifferent son. By a stroke of luck that left both my parents and teachers dumbstruck, I was admitted to a decent American university. On the plane ride home after graduating, one of the most heartbreaking journeys I've undertaken, I read Anthony Bourdain's Kitchen Confidential. It was 2002. I was 22. And utterly lost. But I can do this, I thought. I spent the next 2 years shuffling papers in government office, keeping my head down and my hair short. We did nothing. Or rather, we spun our wheels with remarkable honesty. We all knew we were spinning our wheels, and no one pretended to have any higher goal than trying to direct the mud we kicked up. To keep myself sane, I went 4 or 5 nights a week to peel vegetables in restaurant kitchens. And that's kind of how I learned to cook.
It's really interesting that you say that. I find I really connected with that because I also, didn't really grow up in like a food-driven family. What was that like in terms of navigating family expectations around what sort of job you had, using your hands versus not using your hands? How did that factor in as you began to take up cooking more?
So my family was sort of very food-centered in the way that my food was a thing that we always talked about and always enjoyed. So the expectation was very much that, food is a thing you do for your family. And so it's domestic labor and you sometimes outsource, and you outsource that if you can. And I think it was traditional in the Singaporean sense in that, or perhaps traditional in the Chinese sense, in that the expectation was that, the first generation are farmers so that the next generation can be accountants.
Yeah.
And so it was very much that kind of mentality.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, similarly, we had all my grandparents were farmers, and the goal was to get everyone off the farm. And so I'm always struck by that dynamic of how much that shifts relationships with food. In the context of Singapore, you really tie in the cultural and the economic, and as you said, secular versus religious. So can you talk a little bit about, how you tie these elements together in your food writing?
Sure. I think good example of this might be to talk about the hawker centers. I read spend a lot of time writing about these in the book because they're such a prominent part of Singapore's food culture. Folks who don't know, the hawker centers are sort of, you imagine this like big open air aircraft hangar. It's basically a roof on posts. And under that roof, you have literally hundreds of individual vendors operating tiny, tiny stalls that are maybe like 10 square meters, literally like 10 feet by 10 feet for those who use American measurements, or 3 by 3 meters if you're metric. And these folks are they're selling street food. It's sort of quotidian, everyday cooking. A lot of people in Singapore eat 3 meals a day at the hawker centers because the food is so cheap and there's so many of them and it's so convenient. And so the hawker centers were built when Singapore was doing its nation building, right? So this is the late 60s, early 70s. The government had Singapore had just gained independence, and the government is doing this urban planning. We're trying to build a country according to like rationalist principles of urban planning. And so we build all these new towns, which are these collections of high-rise public housing. And, good urban planning principles, you need to give these clusters of people everything they need. And among them is access to prepared food. And so when we do this, we kill two birds with one stone, because at the time there was a lot of informal employment too, right? So a lot of folks were doing street hawking and selling these prepared foods on the street. So, okay, great. You can clean up the streets. You put the hawkers in the hawker centers. That organizes them and makes it a lot more orderly, enables you to license them, all that. And at the same time, you are giving the residents of these new towns access to prepared food. And what does that do? Gets women out of the home. So this was also the period when, we started getting a lot of women into the workforce. And the workforce then, and the primary industry then was light manufacturing, electronics, garments, So the government built the housing together with childcare and the hawker centers and factories next to it, right? So this was all in the name of economic development. And that's sort of a long introduction, but I think it gives a sense of like how these threads come together.
Yeah, thank you so much for walking through those, the threads as they interweave too, because I find that something that, like, particularly in Canada, I think we hold Singapore to this high regard in terms of like how much social components are embedded into policy or into economics, or like our understanding of it. I feel like it's what we want here and it's not executed the same way. But in terms of, this is happening in the 1960s onward, has there been momentum to continue to support these social structures, or do you see those shift with new governments or shifts in perspective nationally?
So thanks for bringing up the kind of what we want in Canada kind of angle, because like I hear this sentiment a lot, right? And Singapore has a few advantages over your typical Western country. The first being that it's very small, so much easier to like be cohesive. And the second is that we have only ever had one party in power. The elections are like, my favorite description comes from The Economist. It's a guided democracy.
Oh, that's a good way
Yeah.
to put it. Yeah.
So power is very centralized and you can steer the whole country, which, let's remember, is only 45 kilometers across at its widest point.
Yeah.
You can steer the whole country pretty easily, right? And so you were asking to what degree this set of priorities or this impetus has continued into the present day. And some aspects of it have, right? Some aspects of it, like we still build new towns. They're still organized according to the same principles. But politically, I would say that in the 60s and 70s, for whatever reason, but the philosophy of government was somewhat more left-wing, and we have gradually shifted to a much more neoliberal free market philosophy. And, a lot of some of the essays in the book deal with these tensions, because what's happened as a result is that because we are so insistent on the free market and this doctrine of self-reliance, we effectively use human beings as part of the social safety net. The head of the central bank has referred to hawkers as part of Singapore's social safety net because they provide cheap, affordable food to people, thus providing a buffer against inflation. But we don't really think about what that means for the people providing the food.
Yes.
So there were periods in Singapore's history when it was possible for hawkers to make a decent living, and those days are increasingly in the past. And we see that in the shifting food landscape, where now hawkers are retiring and the hawker centers are increasingly filling with franchises and chains because
Mm.
that's the only way you can survive as a hawker today.
Wow. Yeah. And so I know you did some reporting too about the cost of labor for hawkers and what that means for, as you said, like keeping food affordable for eaters. But can you
Mhm.
talk about how those costs end up affecting hawkers on the day to day, in terms of business operations, in terms of their labor, their, health, holistically speaking, just beyond the physical as well?
Wow. I feel like so the last time I did a deep dive into this was in 2022 or so. So my numbers are going to be a little bit out of date. And something that's happened in the years since is that hawker food prices have been subject to inflation like everything else. I don't think they've caught up quite enough to provide hawkers with a decent living, as seen by the fact that a lot of stalls continue to close and and there's a great deal of lamenting every time we lose one of these old institutions. Yet we seem to have decided collectively that we're powerless to do anything about it.
Right.
The latest was a Minangkabau eatery called Warung Pariaman. That happened just a couple of months ago. They've been in business 70 years. They are the only, as far as I know, the only place in Singapore that still does all its cooking or most of its cooking over charcoal. They
Oh,
literally
wow.
like set up a charcoal burner in the back alley behind this little stall and they cook everything, even just the simple sambal. The simplest sambal is sort of a condiment for your food. And this is, as far as I know, it's literally just cooked chilies, maybe a little bit of shallot. And
Mm.
because they're cooking over charcoal, it develops this incredible smoky flavor that you just don't have in any other place in Singapore. And they've been in business 70 years and they just announced that they're closing because someone's raising the rent on them.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so we seem to have decided that this is okay. Like because we want the free market because we believe in the free market. We believe that rents should be set at market rate. And
Yeah.
if people can't afford it, people can't afford it. And from the hawker's perspective, okay, like your rent's going up. What are you going to do? Well, in America, we'd probably say just raise your prices precisely because hawkers are embedded in the community, right? And so if you read interviews with them, if you talk to them, a lot of the times they will say to you, yeah, my costs are going up, but if I raise my prices, what about all these people who depend on me? Like,
Yeah.
what about all these old grandmas and grandpas who come here and have been coming to me to eat my noodles or my youtiao, my crullers for 45 years?
Yeah. And how do you navigate that? I mean, that's one of those rare situations where, like, I think from a more Western perspective, like we're so deeply embedded in that neoliberal mindset that it ends up being the community, the people that are eating that are the ones that have to navigate that more. So in that setting, what's the toll on hawkers when they have to navigate these pieces?
I don't feel I can authentically speak for them because I have never done it. Right?
Fair. Yeah.
I have never done it. I have never gone to someone who's retiring to ask, like, hey, how do you feel? Like, but at the same time, you know, in the in the reporting that you read, you hear about people choosing not to pass it on, people talking about how they don't want their children to join the trade, and people saying like, look, I'm going to franchise because, or the new generation comes in and they go, I have to franchise because
Mm.
otherwise I cannot feed my family.
Which is pretty significant when you think about the idea of hawker centers and Singaporean food more broadly. I'm curious about the authenticity component when you're thinking about national foods of Singapore and what that authenticity represents. Can you speak a bit to what's valued in that dynamic?
So yeah, I mean, in Singapore, food is identity, right? Like
Mm.
we're a young country. We don't really have a national identity. And like when I was in school, the government they actually launched this like national education curriculum to try and instill some sense of cultural belonging.
Oh, Oh,
Yeah,
interesting.
and and at the same time, like if you ask any Singaporean, the first thing to talk about what distinguishes the country, they'll talk about the food. They'll talk about the hawker centers. They'll talk about the way we eat. They'll talk about the fact that, so many different food cultures come together in this one place.
Hmm.
And I think there's been a reluctance, I guess, to acknowledge how quickly that's changing today. Like, because our borders are open, we're a tiny country. So now you have hawker centers that are full of stalls selling Japanese ramen or Sichuan food or,
Yeah.
burgers and craft beer. And none of these were a thing when I was growing up. Yet we, as in many other places, I think we have a pretty ossified idea of what counts as authentic Singaporean food. And we are reluctant to say, well, authenticity is what we as a people do.
Yeah.
Authenticity is something we kind of create as we go along.
Yeah. I like that phrasing.
Uh, and my favorite Singaporean cookbook is a book called Among Ixoras by Brian Coe. It's my favorite cookbook because I think it really reflects how people eat in Singapore today. So he does things that like, I guess he came from a somewhat well-off family.
Mm.
And so he talks about both the things his grandparents cooked and the things his domestic helpers cooked and the things that like his family's driver would bring in from the hawker stalls and the things he ate in canteens. And I think that picture is sort of uh, complete and honest and holistic and actually really representative of how if you're in Singapore today, you eat things. There's so many people cooking for you, right?
Mm.
You
Yeah.
cook for yourself, your parents cook for you, hawkers cook for you, sometimes domestic helpers cook for you. And that that is just such a jumble.
Yeah. And it's interesting, what you're saying reminds me of, I'm not sure if you're familiar with J.P. McMahon, who's like a chef in Ireland.
I've heard the name, but I've never eaten their food.
Me neither, but he does a lot of food writing on defining Irish cuisine and like understanding this nationalism for an island-based country, and ultimately comes to the conclusion that because it's an island, because there's been so many waves of immigration, because there's so much flux, defining a particular national cuisine, it remains a challenge because it changes as you get new people and it changes the social fabric. Do you find in Singapore that there are more negotiations happening, or I guess how is that navigated, particularly within that increased neoliberal component that you've talked about as well?
So I think, so in Singapore today, we continue to encourage immigration, right? So I think the country is almost growing. It's not quite growing primarily through immigration. There's still there's still population growth, but there's certainly a lot more immigration than there was when I was growing up. And it's primarily coming from India and China because they have very large populations and those are countries with a lot of connections to Singapore, right? Both historic and just like in terms of sheer numbers. So there's actually a certain amount of tension that happens because the Singaporean Chinese culture is not mainland Chinese culture.
Right. Yeah.
And so there's this wave of immigration quite visibly changing the culinary landscape. We call it the Malafication of everything. Right?
Mm.
The increasing presence of Sichuan foods and of Sichuan cooking, which really was not a thing when I was growing up because the Singapore Chinese population is primarily from southern China.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. And I think people forget that defining a national cuisine, declaring a national cuisine is a political act.
Yeah.
And I think to me, Singapore, the quote unquote national cuisine of Singapore is maybe less about picking a dish or picking a way of eating and more about thinking about the systems that gave rise to how we eat, the hawker centers. Choosing to build the hawker centers was an act of conscious nation building. And it was also a huge capital injection for all these people who could never have afforded to build a stall. And I think there's something, and I think the only country in the world that's ever done that.
I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah, like that to me is really remarkable. Like
Yeah.
there's been some attention to public restaurants, right? So like what's her name? Little Little Fires in the Kitchen.
Yes. Is that Rebecca May Johnson?
Yes, Rebecca May Johnson, thank you. She wrote that thing about I Dream of Canteens, and like
Yeah.
Britain had the wartime restaurants. I think Canada probably had a similar institution. And communist China had its canteens. So there have been many countries with a sort of public infrastructure of food, but Singapore, I think, is the only one where there was this sort of merger of like public infrastructure and small scale individual enterprise. And what that meant was that, there was a whole generation of hawkers who were able to be in business for themselves.
Which is pretty profound. I mean, I think a lot about that in terms of, policy or even just using hawker centers as like this foundation for policy and for structure. Yeah, I mean, looking to the Canadian context, I'm always so fascinated because our food policy is more about agricultural exports than it is about
Mhm.
feeding the people. And so you see the cracks as we start to grow our populations and as things shift globally because there's no foundation that's like rooted in people and community. It's definitely, it's definitely a different struggle. And I'm curious to get your thoughts because I know you've spoken about how Singapore is framed as this food paradise that holds this dark mirror to USA and Asia. So what are some of those things that mirror can reveal?
So I think this goes back to your earlier statement about how Canada would quite like to be like Singapore in some ways, right? So I think, I think this is what happens when when a very orderly, very cohesive place speed runs towards a really neoliberal food system.
Hmm.
Have long been dependent on a sort of laboring underclass. Like when I was peeling vegetables in the kitchens, everyone I worked with was Malaysian Chinese
Mm.
because Singaporeans didn't want the jobs. And this was in the early aughts, right? And I think you see a similar dynamic of immigrant labor in the West and population in it that largely doesn't realize how dependent we are on it.
Hmm. Yep, big time.
And I think because we are a global city, because land is limited and has always been limited, we have also done a bit of the speed running of the rent pressures that you increasingly see in large metropolitan areas in America.
Oh, yes. Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that's something too where we're constantly thinking about like urban sprawl. And I often think about like Winnipeg as a city as like one of those really interesting places to look
Mhm.
at that because there was no city planning because it's all prairie, it's all flat, there's nothing. And so because of that, there really is it just continues to expand outward in this
Mhm.
very disjointed way that, is possible for like walking anywhere.
Yeah.
Yep.
And in Singapore, there's nowhere to sprawl.
Yeah, yeah.
And because we view the land and housing as an investment vehicle, well, you've got to keep the real estate investment trust profits going up.
Mm,
And that is a dynamic that's creating a lot of demand pressures on the hawkers today. At the same time, part of me wonders just, I talked about how hawkers, one of the remarkable things about hawkers is the fact that they're basically in business for themselves.
yeah.
And in the book, I write about Urban Hawker in New York, which was this attempt to export the hawker center wholesale. And the way they did that was by filling it with hawker brands, quote unquote, which take hawker food and instead of having hawkers who are sort of cooking for themselves, where a hawker stall is a family business, they are massive chains that are staffed by low wage labor.
Wow.
And meanwhile, back in Singapore, the government has responded to the pressures on the hawker economy by instituting a bunch of sort of hawker assistance schemes where they try to essentially teach hawkers to brand themselves and automate their cooking in the name of becoming more efficient and
Mm,
also essentially preparing to become brands because I guess that's what it means to be in business for yourself today. Like,
Wow.
I don't know how much of this is just wrong-headed versus just the reality of working for yourself in 2020, 2026.
That's a big question, I think. I think that's a big question on a lot of people's minds is like how much do people have to brand themselves to continue building a business in this like globalized era where that seems to be the prominent focus.
Yeah, and you and I are both on Substack, right?
Yeah,
So like
exactly. Point proven. Yeah. And it's so I'm curious, because you talked a little bit about the franchising. Can you speak a little bit to how that's impacted the food in Singapore and in terms of what foods are available, how people are thinking about food? Has there been a shift as franchises have entered hawker centers or beyond?
absolutely. I am quite torn about this
Mm,
because, as we just discussed, like what you eat, like authenticity is what you live today. And so there are hawker dishes that are disappearing, such as, the one I think about is cuttlefish bihun, which is this dish of rice noodles and not fresh cuttlefish, but specifically dried cuttlefish reconstituted in alkaline water.
mm,
So the flesh is not white anymore. The flesh is sort of tan colored. It looks like leather.
wow.
And it's served with a sauce it's often served with a sauce that is that's peanut based. So it tastes like, if you've ever had satay sauce, it
Yeah,
tastes like
yeah.
that.
Cool.
And that's a really old school dish. And like, it's just disappearing because people aren't eating it. And pig organ soup, which is this beautiful, clear broth of all the pig's spare parts. Again, it is old people's food. Like, I think
Mm,
no one under the age of 65 eats it. Like, so those dishes are disappearing. And is that because of franchising? Is it natural evolution of the Singaporean diet? I don't know. But the thing that I do know is that part of what makes hawker culture is that you have hundreds, if not thousands, of practitioners cooking kind of what's essentially the same dish at heart. And you have this enormous range of stylistic variation between them. Absolutely enormous. And as more hawkers become chains, we lose that.
yeah.
And then as we lose that, I think what's really pernicious is that subsequent generations grow up thinking that these things are singular.
Yeah.
Because if the only nasi lemak you ever eat is the one from this one chain, how do you realize that this dish is actually a whole culture in itself?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. It reminds me of, I think often about, I took this like archaeology course in undergrad where it was looking at like the collapse of complex societies in ancient times and those that were able to manage huge shifts in terms of like be it weather or war or other sorts of socio-political events were ones that had such a diverse range of strategies to navigate. And the moment that societies started to kind of optimize and really lean into one method of aquaculture or agriculture, whatever,
Mhm.
that's when it becomes more difficult to react to changes too. And I often wonder about that with food. When you spoke about using different parts of the pig in the dish, how much is it a shift in terms of what people value of the pig or the abundance of pig shifting in time too?
Yeah, it's really hard for me to say. I mean, like, we have, if you take the very long view, as you just did when talking about the collapse of ancient societies, then we have always aspired to eat what, people higher up the social ladder eat, right?
Yeah.
And now that Singapore's a developed country, like we are at the top of the social ladder, we could be eating virtually anything at all. So I guess now we're importing our inspirations from Paris and Tokyo and
Mm,
Miami.
yeah. Yeah. In terms of, having published Little Perfections and bringing that into the world, what are some takeaways that you would like people to have when they experience your analysis of Singaporean food systems?
I'd like them to go to Singapore before the hawkers disappear, I guess,
Yeah.
because this is not a thing, it's not a thing that you can describe. It's not a thing. The thing I love about food is that it is so hard to describe. It is so hard to convey the experience of eating, of actually eating something. And it is even harder to convey the experience of actually being in a place and seeing how people interact with food every day. And I hope that Little Perfections enables you to do that without going to Singapore, but there's also no substitute for actually going there and eating at some of my favorite stalls yourself.
Yes, I think that's a great takeaway.
And I think another thing I'd say is that if you're living in Singapore and reading it and listening to this, maybe there are some people who are doing that. I really hope that the book encourages you to cook, because something we barely touched on today is how much of the culture depends on home cooking. Like it comes back to the thing we said earlier. I said earlier about how, when as chains spread, the diversity within a dish is lost. And if not enough of us are cooking at home, then the diversity within our cuisine is lost, and the appreciation for how the dishes came to be is lost.
So like an act of resistance in a way.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I love that. I was thinking, because I visited Singapore. I had like a 24-hour layover when I was 16.
Yeah, you mentioned.
And it was one of the most life-changing opportunities. Like, it was such a small period of time, but the tour guide had insisted that we do go to see a hawker center. And it was, as you said, like indescribable. The idea of like commensality and being in place with people eating is just unlike anything I've seen elsewhere too. Yeah,
and you're eating, and like at the table next to you, there might be some hawkers preparing for their next shift, right?
Yeah.
Because space is just used that way. Yeah, and you're that intertwined. Like, the eaters and the cooks are that intertwined, and there's a sense of equality that you don't get in a restaurant. You don't get it in McDonald's, right?
No, certainly not. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, TW. It was such a pleasure chatting with you more about your book.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, anytime. Do you mind sharing where people can check you out online if they want to follow along and learn more?
Absolutely. So my Substack is called Let Them Eat Cake. So letthemeatcake.substack.com. And you can find me online at my personal website, humblescrivener.com.
Awesome. I'll put those in the show notes for people. Thank you, TW.
Amazing. Thanks, Sarah.
That was TW Lim. I've linked his book, Little Perfections, his newsletter, website, and social media in the show notes below to follow along if you want to learn more. You can also find all this at anthodish.com under episodes. Thanks so much for listening to Anthodish Podcast. Subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like the show, please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts to help get the word out. For more Anthodish, you could sign up for my newsletter at sarahdougnan.substack.com, or find me on TikTok, Threads, Instagram, or Blue Sky at Anthodish Podcast. I always love hearing from you and what you've been thinking about food. Music production was done by Lucas Wojcicki at lucassound.com. Anthodish is produced in partnership with the American Anthropological Association. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll catch you next week.